My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. I was sitting on a cold hospital bench outside the ICU, 3 feet from the door where my father was taking his last breath. I thought it was the doctor. I opened it anyway. It was a termination email. 7 years. Erased. While my dad was dying 10 feet away from me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even cry. I just sat there in that empty hallway, reading those words over and over. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. And then, that door opened. And I saw exactly whose face was staring back at me. My name is Marcus Webb. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago where I saw myself at 34, I would have said exactly where I was. Senior Logistics Coordinator at Draven Supply Co., Cincinnati, Ohio. Decent salary, solid reputation. A guy the whole floor came to when something needed fixing. I wasn't flashy, wasn't political, I just worked. While other people were networking at company happy hours and playing golf with the VP, I was the one staying until 8 p.m., untangling shipping disasters that nobody else wanted to touch. That was me. That was always me. 7 years I gave that company. 7 years of early mornings, missed weekends, and lunches eaten at my desk. I covered for teammates who called in sick. I trained new hires who later got promoted over me. I never complained. I told myself, keep your head down, do the work, the right people will notice. The right people never notice. That's the first lie corporate America sells you. The person who did notice, for all the wrong reasons, was my boss, Gerald Holt, Director of Operations, 12 years at Draven. The kind of man who wore a firm handshake like a costume, polished, politically wired. He knew every executive's wife's name and every VP's golf handicap. He could walk into a room and make you feel like he was your biggest supporter, right up until the moment he needed something from you. Gerald was the type who never did the work, but always took the credit. Every quarterly report that made leadership nod and smile, my numbers, my logistics restructuring, my late nights. Gerald would present it with a smile and a clicker and somehow make it sound like his vision. I knew it. My teammates knew it. And for 7 years, I let it happen. 2 weeks before everything collapsed, Gerald called me into his office and closed the door. He leaned back in that oversized chair of his, looked at me with that rehearsed sincerity, and said, Marcus, between you and me, the regional operations manager position is yours. You've earned it. I'm going to personally push this through by end of quarter. No email, no documentation, just his word. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. Meanwhile, outside of work, my world was already quietly falling apart. My father, Raymond Webb, had been fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months. Every week I drove him to chemo. Every weekend I sat with him in that small house on Ellison Street where I grew up, watching him get smaller, watching the man who taught me how to shake hands and stand straight slowly disappear inside his own body. He never complained either. That's where I got it from. I was managing everything at once. Hospital appointments, insurance calls, work deadlines, my own grief, all running simultaneously like tabs I couldn't close. I wasn't sleeping. I was functioning. There's a difference, but I kept telling myself, just hold on. The promotion is coming. Dad is still here. Just hold on. I was holding on to 2 things at once, and I didn't realize that someone had already decided to let go of me. It was a Tuesday morning when my phone rang and the number on the screen was Cincinnati General Hospital. I already knew from the tone of the nurse's voice before she finished her sentence. Dad's condition had dropped overnight. Rapid deterioration. They were moving him to the ICU. She used words like comfort measures and family presence recommended. Hospital language for, come now while you still can. I closed my laptop, grabbed my keys, and on the way out I did everything right. I sent a message to Gerald directly. Family emergency. Father hospitalized, ICU. I'll be reachable by phone and will manage what I can remotely. I copied HR. I followed every protocol I had ever been taught. Gerald's response came 11 minutes later. A thumbs up emoji. That's it. No take care of your family. No keep us posted. Just a small yellow thumb pointed upward on a screen. I stared at it for a second, then put my phone in my pocket and walked into that hospital. The first 2 days were a blur of doctors, paperwork, and my father drifting in and out of consciousness. I sat in that ICU room for hours at a time, watching machines breathe for him, answering emails from my phone when he slept, fielding calls from our logistics vendors like I wasn't watching my father die 3 feet away. I was still working, broken, exhausted, running on vending machine coffee and pure obligation, but still working. On day 3, one of our biggest freight accounts had a scheduling conflict. I resolved it remotely in 40 minutes from a hospital waiting room. I sent Gerald the update with full documentation. He forwarded it to the VP without a single word of acknowledgement. Just forwarded it. My work, my solution. His forward. I noticed, I said nothing. I went back to my father's room. Day 3 became day 4. Day 4 became day 5. And then, at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night, my phone buzzed. I was alone in the hallway. The overnight nurses had dimmed the corridor lights. The hospital had that specific nighttime silence, the kind that feels heavier than regular quiet. I was sitting with my back against the wall, head tilted back, eyes burning. I picked up my phone thinking it was the on-call physician with an update on Dad's labs. The subject line read, "Employment Termination Notice, Marcus Webb, Draven Supply Co." I blinked, read it again, then a third time. After careful review of recent performance metrics and availability concerns, Draven Supply Co. has made the decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Your consistent failure to maintain required operational standards and professional availability leaves us no alternative. I stopped reading. My hands were steady. That scared me more than shaking would have. 7 years. 7 years of my life, summarized into a 4-paragraph email sent at midnight while my father was dying behind a door 10 feet away from where I was sitting. But it wasn't just the firing that gutted me. It was the language. Consistent failure to maintain availability. I had been gone 5 days. 5 days, with documented notice, HR copied, emergency clearly communicated. And Gerald had framed it as a pattern, as a character flaw, as something that had apparently been building for a long time. That's when the cold feeling shifted into something sharper. I scrolled to the termination document attached to the email. And there, at the top, the effective date of termination. It wasn't today's date. It was backdated by 11 days, 4 days before my father was even admitted to the ICU. Gerald hadn't just fired me while my dad was dying. He had rewritten the timeline so that on paper, legally, officially, I had been terminated before any of this ever happened. Before the hospital, before the emergency, before any of it. Which meant, according to Draven Supply Co.'s official records, I hadn't been fired for abandoning my dying father. I had simply been a failing employee who was let go. Clean, neat, untouchable. I sat in that hallway for a long time after that, not crying, not calling anyone, just thinking about how long it must have taken him to plan something that precise. I put my phone face down on the seat beside me. Then I stood up, walked to the small hospital bathroom at the end of the corridor, turned on the cold water, and stood over the sink for a long time, just breathing. The fluorescent light above me buzzed faintly. The water ran over my hands. I watched it circle the drain and disappear. I had approximately 45 seconds before a nurse would come get me for the next check-in. 45 seconds to feel whatever I needed to feel, and then lock it somewhere deep enough that my father wouldn't see it on my face. I turned off the water, dried my hands, walked back down the hallway, and when I pushed open that ICU door and my father turned his head slowly toward me, I smiled, like nothing had happened. Like the last 7 years of my life hadn't just been erased with a timestamp manipulation and 4 corporate paragraphs. "You eat anything?" he asked, voice thin, barely above a whisper. "Yeah, Dad, I'm good." He looked at me the way he always had, like he could see straight through whatever face I was putting on. Raymond Webb had that gift. He didn't push it, though. He just nodded slowly and turned back toward the window. That night was the longest of my life. I sat in that chair beside his bed, and I held two things at the same time: grief and fury. And I couldn't release either one. I couldn't cry about my father because the anger kept cutting through it. I couldn't focus on the betrayal because every time I looked at his hands, those big, worn hands that used to fix everything, the grief swallowed me whole again. I've heard people talk about being numb. I always thought that meant you felt nothing. That's not what it is. Numb is when you feel everything simultaneously and your brain simply refuses to process any of it because the volume is too high. That's what I was. A person sitting in a hospital chair feeling too much to feel anything clearly. Around 2 a.m., Dad stirred. He was in and out all night. The medication kept pulling him under and then releasing him back to the surface in fragments. But around 2 a.m., he opened his eyes with unusual clarity, like the fog had briefly lifted. He looked at me and said, "You look like something sitting on your chest, Marcus." I almost broke right there. Almost. "Just tired, Dad." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved to the ceiling. Then he said something so slowly and deliberately that it landed like it had been prepared. "People always show you who they really are when they think you're already down. Remember that." I didn't respond. I couldn't trust my voice. He closed his eyes again, and within minutes he was back under. But those words didn't leave me. They attached themselves somewhere behind my sternum and stayed there. Because he wasn't talking about Gerald Holt. He didn't even know about Gerald Holt. He was talking from 81 years of living, sharing the kind of wisdom that comes from its own painful history. But it landed exactly where it needed to land, exactly when it needed to. Raymond Webb passed away at 6:22 a.m. on a Friday morning. I was holding his hand. The machines flatlined with a sound that I will never fully unhear, no matter how many years pass. The nurses came in quietly. Someone put a hand on my shoulder. I nodded at things people said to me, without processing a single word. I walked outside the hospital, into the early morning Cincinnati air. Pale gray sky. Cold, birds already starting somewhere in the distance. And I stood on that sidewalk, completely alone. No job. No father. Nothing left to hold on to. And somewhere underneath all of that grief, something else was happening. Something quieter and far more dangerous than sadness. It wasn't anger exactly. Anger is loud. Anger wants to flip tables and make phone calls and say things you can't take back. This was different. This was the specific cold clarity that only arrives after you've lost everything you were afraid of losing. And you realize there is absolutely nothing left to protect you from the truth. Gerald Holt had calculated that I was vulnerable, that grief would keep me quiet, that a man burying his father wouldn't have the energy to fight back. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. I drove home from that hospital with two things locked in my chest: my father's last words, and a backdated termination email that somebody had made a very serious mistake putting in writing. I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to grieve, to handle arrangements, to sit in my father's house on Ellison Street and go through the motions of loss. 3 days to let people bring food I didn't eat and say things I didn't hear and hug me in doorways while I nodded and thanked them. On the 4th day, I opened my laptop. Not to job search, not to update my resume, not to do any of the things a recently fired, recently bereaved person is supposed to do when they're trying to put their life back together. I opened it to build a case. The first thing I did was go back through every email I had ever sent or received at Draven Supply Co. 3 years worth of correspondence, still accessible through my personal forwarding address before they cut my system access completely. Gerald had moved fast on the termination, but not fast enough to scrub everything. And that's the thing about paper trails. People who abuse power rarely think about them in the moment. They're too focused on the outcome to worry about the receipts. I started a folder, named it simply Raymond, after my father, because that's what this was for now. Within 40 minutes of digging, I found the first crack in Gerald's story. Buried in an email thread from 6 weeks prior, a chain between Gerald and the VP of Operations regarding internal award nominations, was Gerald's own words, typed and time-stamped. Nominating Marcus Webb for Q3 Regional Performance Excellence. His restructuring of the Cincinnati freight routing alone saved the division an estimated $340,000 this quarter. Strong candidate. 3 weeks before my father was hospitalized. 2 weeks before Gerald sat across from me and promised me a promotion. And 11 days before a termination document was backdated to make me look like a consistently failing employee. I stared at that email for a long time. Then I screenshot it, saved it 3 separate places, and added it to the folder. Consistent failure to maintain operational standards. Gerald had written that termination language himself, about a man he had personally nominated for a Performance Excellence Award weeks earlier. The contradiction wasn't just embarrassing, it was legally catastrophic for him, and he had no idea I had it. I contacted an employment attorney on a Thursday morning. Her name was Patricia Osei, a labor law specialist in Cincinnati, with a reputation for taking on exactly this kind of corporate misconduct case. A colleague from my gym had used her 2 years prior and said she was the kind of lawyer who made HR departments physically uncomfortable. I sat across from her in a small, organized office and laid out everything. The promise of promotion. The thumbs up emoji the day I notified Gerald about the hospitalization. The termination email sent at 11:47 p.m. The backdated effective date. The performance nomination that directly contradicted the termination language. Patricia didn't react dramatically. She just took notes, quietly, methodically. And when I finished, she looked up and said, "Mr. Webb, document backdating in a termination case involving a medical family emergency is not just an HR violation. Depending on what we find, this could constitute fraud." She said it the way doctors deliver serious diagnoses. Calm, factual, letting the weight of the words do the work themselves. I nodded slowly. "What do we do first?" I asked. "We file an EEOC complaint, and then we let them panic." But Patricia wasn't the only card I had. While I was building the legal file, I quietly reached out to 2 former colleagues, Devin Sharp, who had left Draven 8 months ago under circumstances that never sat right with me, and Angela Tross, a former project lead, who had transferred to another division after a conflict with Gerald that HR had quietly buried. Both of them responded within 24 hours. Both of them had stories. Devin had been pushed out after Gerald took credit for a vendor negotiation that saved the company over $500,000, when the internal documentation clearly showed it was Devin's work entirely. Angela had been passed over for a promotion that Gerald had verbally promised her, and when she raised it formally, suddenly her performance reviews started reflecting problems that had never been mentioned before. Same playbook, same man, different victims. I added their documented accounts to the folder. Raymond was getting thick. There was one more thing I found, and this one I almost missed entirely. Deep in an old forwarded email chain, one I had been accidentally CC'd on during a system migration 18 months ago and never deleted, was an internal exchange between Gerald and Draven's legal counsel. A routine discussion about termination procedures and documentation timing. And in that chain, Gerald had asked a very specific question. If a termination is processed with an adjusted effective date, how far back can that date reasonably be set before it triggers an audit flag? He had been researching how to backdate documents before he ever used it on me. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't a panicked decision made while I was in the hospital. This was premeditated. Gerald Holt had built himself a trap door long before he ever decided to push me through it. He just never considered that I'd find the blueprint. I saved that email 4 times in 4 different locations. Then I closed my laptop, made coffee, and sat at my father's kitchen table in the quiet of that old house on Ellison Street. People always show you who they really are when they think you're already down. I heard it again, clear as the morning he said it. "I hear you, Dad. I hear you." 3 weeks after filing the EEOC complaint, I received a letter from Draven Supply Co.'s HR department. Standard language, formal tone, requesting my participation in a mandatory exit interview as part of their internal review process. Patricia had told me this might happen. Companies initiate these when a formal complaint is filed, trying to get ahead of the narrative, trying to find inconsistencies in your account before the case develops momentum. "Go," Patricia told me. "Say very little, observe everything, and call me the moment you leave that building." I put on the same suit I wore to my father's funeral. Seemed fitting somehow. Draven Supply Co.'s Cincinnati office hadn't changed in the 3 weeks I'd been gone. Same glass lobby, Same security badge scanner I no longer had access to. I had to sign in as a visitor this time. The receptionist handed me a paper tag that said "Guest" in bold letters, and I clipped it to my lapel without a word. The irony of wearing a visitor badge in a building I had given 7 years of my life to was not lost on me. I was directed to the third-floor conference room, room 3C. I had sat in that room for hundreds of meetings, budget reviews, quarterly planning sessions, vendor negotiations. I knew every scratch on that table. I sat down, folded my hands, waited. The door opened, and the person who walked in carrying a manila folder and a legal notepad was not someone from HR that I recognized. She was mid-20s, sharp, professional, dark blazer. She moved with the focused efficiency of someone who took her work seriously. She set her folder down, pulled out the chair across from me, and extended her hand. "Mr. Webb, I'm Danielle Holt, HR Compliance. I'll be conducting your exit review today." I shook her hand, and the name landed on me like a stone dropped into still water. Holt. I kept my face completely neutral. Years of corporate meetings had taught me at least that much. But underneath the surface, my entire mind was recalibrating at speed. Gerald Holt's daughter, sitting across from me, holding my termination file, conducting the very review that had been triggered by my complaint against her father. I said nothing. I simply nodded and waited for her to begin. Danielle opened the folder with the practiced efficiency of someone running a routine procedure. She had clearly not connected my name to her father yet. Why would she? Marcus Webb was one file among dozens. She hadn't been in the room when Gerald made promises. She hadn't seen the thumbs-up emoji. She was simply doing her job. She began with standard questions. Tenure, role, last documented performance review. I answered briefly, calmly, giving her exactly what was on record, nothing more. And then she turned to the termination document. I watched the moment it happened. It was subtle, just a slight pause, a fraction of a second where her eyes stopped moving across the page and her pen went still. She turned back one page, then forward again. Then she reached into the folder and pulled out a second document, cross-referencing something. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had found the backdated effective date. I knew she'd found it because of what she did next. She didn't say anything. She didn't react. But she quietly turned the folder slightly away from my line of sight, which told me she'd seen something that required privacy to process. That's not a trained response. That's a personal one. Danielle Holt had been specifically hired into HR compliance. Patricia had pulled her professional background after I gave her the name. 8 months at Draven, Masters in Labor Relations from Ohio State, certified compliance auditor. Document backdating wasn't just something she'd been taught to flag. It was exactly the category of violation she had been hired to catch, and she was staring at her own father's signature at the bottom of it. The temperature in that room shifted in a way I can't fully describe. We were still conducting a routine exit interview on the surface, questions and answers, professional distance. But underneath that, something enormous was happening in real time behind Danielle Holt's carefully composed expression. She looked up from the folder, and for just a moment, less than 2 seconds, her eyes met mine with something unscripted in them. Not sympathy exactly, not guilt, something more complicated than either of those things. The look of a person who has just understood the full weight of a situation and is deciding, in real time, what kind of person they are going to be about it. Then it was gone. Professionalism snapped back into place like a shutter closing. "Mr. Webb," she said carefully, "I may need to pause this review and request some additional documentation before we proceed. Is that acceptable?" "Take whatever time you need," I said. She nodded once, closed the folder, and I noticed she did not put it back in her bag. She kept it on the table in front of her, held onto it deliberately. I walked out of that building, stood on the sidewalk, and called Patricia. "How did it go?" she asked. I looked back up at the third-floor window for a moment. "Something just changed," I said. "I don't know exactly what yet, but something just changed." Patricia was quiet for a beat. "Good," she said. "That's usually when it gets interesting." She had no idea how right she was. 4 days after that exit interview, Patricia called me at 8 a.m. Not an email, not a text, a direct call. and the tone in her voice told me everything before she said a single word. Marcus, Draven's internal compliance division has opened a formal investigation, independent of our EEOC filing. Separate track, separate documentation request. This didn't come from us. I stood in my kitchen, coffee going cold in my hand. It came from inside, I said. It came from inside, she confirmed. I set the mug down slowly. Danielle Holt had opened the investigation herself. What happened over the next 11 days, I pieced together gradually. Through Patricia, through Devon, through Angela, and eventually through sources inside Draven who had watched the whole thing unfold from their own desks. Danielle had gone back to her office after our exit interview and spent 3 hours cross-referencing the termination documentation against Draven's internal HR system. The backdated effective date. The performance nomination Gerald had submitted in my name, weeks before firing me. The language in the termination letter versus the language in my actual performance reviews, which showed no documented warnings, no performance improvement plans, nothing that legally or procedurally justified the narrative Gerald had constructed. Every single piece contradicted every single other piece. And then she found the same internal email chain I had found. The one where Gerald had asked legal counsel about how far back a termination date could be adjusted before triggering an audit flag. Danielle had access to the full unredacted version, the one with legal counsel's response included. The response that said, "We would strongly advise against any retroactive adjustment of termination dates, as this could expose the company to significant legal liability." Gerald had received that advice in writing, and he had done it anyway. Danielle escalated immediately to Draven's chief compliance officer, bypassing her own direct supervisor, who happened to report to Gerald's division. That decision alone told me everything I needed to know about who Danielle Holt was when it actually mattered. She didn't tip off her father. She didn't make a quiet phone call to give him time to prepare. She didn't soften the edges or bury the finding in bureaucratic language that would take months to surface. She filed a clean, formal, fully documented compliance report, and she put her name on it. I only found out much later what that cost her personally. The dinner table conversations that stopped, the phone calls that went unanswered, the particular silence that falls in a family when one person chooses integrity over blood. I never asked her about it directly. Some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. Gerald Holt was called into a disciplinary meeting on a Tuesday morning. From what I was told, and I'll be honest, I savored every detail. He walked in expecting a routine management briefing. He had no idea what was waiting for him. No one had leaked it. No one had given him the professional courtesy of advance warning. The same courtesy he had not extended to me when he sent a termination email at midnight while my father was dying. The room contained Draven's chief compliance officer, 2 members of the executive leadership team, and an outside legal representative. They walked him through the documentation systematically. The backdated termination, the performance nomination filed in my name weeks prior, the legal counsel email he had ignored, the pattern of similar conduct identified through Devon's and Angela's documented accounts, which Patricia had formally submitted as supporting evidence to the EEOC complaint, and which Danielle's investigation had independently corroborated. Gerald reportedly said very little for the first 40 minutes, and then he made his final mistake. He told them I had manipulated his daughter, that I had somehow identified Danielle before the exit interview and engineered the situation to use her against him, that her investigation was compromised by outside influence and shouldn't be considered credible. The room went very quiet after that, because Danielle was prepared for exactly this. She had submitted a separate written statement to the compliance office 2 days before the disciplinary meeting, voluntarily, unprompted, without anyone asking her to. In it, she documented the precise timeline of her involvement when she received the file, when she identified the discrepancies, when she escalated. Every step logged, time-stamped, and verified against the HR system's own access records. She had also included one final line that Patricia read to me over the phone, almost word for word. At no point prior to or during the exit interview did Mr. Webb indicate any awareness of my identity or familial connection to the Director of Operations. The findings of this investigation are based entirely on documentary evidence and stand independent of any external complaint. Gerald's last move had been to throw his own daughter under the bus. and she had already built the documentation to make sure it didn't work. Gerald Holt was placed on immediate administrative leave, pending termination proceedings. The same HR infrastructure he had weaponized against me. The performance language, the documentation requirements, the formal review process, was now being applied to him with the full weight of a compliance investigation behind it. Every procedural protection he had carefully stripped away from my case was being enforced to the letter in his. Patricia told me he hired an attorney within 48 hours. His attorney apparently reviewed the documentation and advised him not to fight it. The EEOC complaint moved forward simultaneously on a separate track, with the internal investigation now on record, corroborating everything Patricia had already filed. The company's legal exposure had expanded significantly. Draven's outside counsel reached out to Patricia within the week. They wanted to discuss resolution. Patricia called me after that first conversation and said simply, "Marcus, they're scared, and scared companies write checks." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 months. Outside my window, Cincinnati was gray and cold and completely ordinary. Just a regular Thursday afternoon. People driving to work, kids walking home from school. The world completely indifferent to the fact that 7 years of injustice had just begun to unravel inside a conference room on the 3rd floor of a glass building downtown. I thought about my father. I thought about that hospital hallway, the cold bench, the buzzing phone, the termination email glowing in the dark while the man who raised me took his final breaths behind a closed door. People always show you who they really are when they think you're already down. He was right, Dad. He was completely right. About Gerald, about Danielle, about all of it. The settlement came through on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks later. I won't share the exact number. Patricia advised against it, and honestly, the number was never really the point. What I will say is that it was significant enough that Draven's legal team had clearly been instructed to make the problem disappear cleanly and permanently. No admission of wrongdoing in the official language. That's standard corporate self-protection. But the size of the check tells its own story without needing words. Patricia called me when it was finalized. She was professional about it, measured, precise, but I could hear something underneath the formality. The quiet satisfaction of a person who had built something airtight and watched it hold. "It's done, Marcus," she said. 2 words. That's all it took. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at nothing for a long time after that. Draven also offered reinstatement as part of the initial negotiation. Full restoration of my position. Back pay calculated from the backdated termination date. Benefits reinstated. Patricia presented it to me as a serious option worth considering. I declined without hesitation. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. I want to be clear about that, because both of those would have been understandable, and neither was what drove the decision. I declined because the version of Marcus Webb who had spent 7 years staying late and eating lunch at his desk and believing that keeping his head down would eventually be enough, that version of me had died somewhere in that hospital hallway. And I had no interest in walking back into the building that buried him. Some doors you close not because you're running from something, but because you finally understand your own worth clearly enough to know which rooms you no longer belong in. I took 3 months off, something I had never once given myself in 7 years of continuous employment. No applications, no LinkedIn updates, no productivity. Just 3 months of existing without an agenda. I slept past 7 a.m. for the first time in years. I cooked actual meals instead of reheating things at my desk. I drove out to Ellison Street every Sunday and sat in my father's house. Still his house in my mind, always his house. And I went through his things slowly, carefully, the way the process deserved. I found an old photograph tucked inside a book on his nightstand. Me and Raymond at a Cincinnati Reds game, maybe 1998. I'm 9 years old, holding a hot dog with both hands, squinting into the sun. He's laughing at something off camera with his whole face, the way he laughed before the years got heavier. I sat on the edge of his bed and held that photograph for a long time. I had been so focused on holding everything together, the job, the bills, the medical appointments, the performance reviews, the corporate politics, that I had almost missed the permission to simply fall apart for a moment, to be a son who lost his father. Not an employee, not a case number, not a plaintiff, just a son. 3 months became a turning point, rather than just a pause. I spent part of that time doing something I hadn't done in years, thinking about what I actually wanted, not what was available, not what made strategic career sense, what I actually wanted from the hours of my life that I was exchanging for a salary. The answer surprised me with how clear it was once I stopped drowning long enough to hear it. I started consulting independently. Logistics optimization. The same work I had been doing for Gerald's quarterly presentations for years, except now under my own name, my own terms, my own client relationships. Within 6 weeks of quietly putting the word out through my professional network, I had 3 contracts. Within 4 months, I had more work than I could manage alone. It turned out that 7 years of being the person who actually solved the problems, while someone else stood at the front of the room taking credit, had built me a reputation that Gerald's name had never been attached to. People in the industry knew whose work it really was. They always do. They just wait until the politics clear before they say it out loud. I found out about the other employees almost by accident. Devin called me one evening about 2 months after the settlement. Not about anything legal, just checking in. And near the end of the conversation he mentioned, almost casually, that 2 more former Draven employees had filed formal complaints against Gerald in the weeks following his administrative leave. Both cases citing similar patterns: backdated documentation, suppressed promotions, credit appropriation. Gerald's termination from Draven had been finalized by then. He was gone. But the cases that came after mine, those weren't triggered by the settlement or the EEOC filing directly. They were triggered by something simpler. By the fact that someone had finally gone on record. By the fact that one person had refused to stay quiet in a hospital hallway at midnight and let a powerful man rewrite the story. People had been waiting for that. Watching. Holding their own folders of documentation and wondering if it was worth the fight. My case told them it was. I hadn't planned that part. I hadn't filed my complaint thinking about anyone else. I did it because my father was gone, and I had nothing left to be afraid of, and Gerald Holt had made a serious mistake putting his fraud in writing. But sometimes the thing you do purely for yourself ends up meaning something larger than you intended. Raymond Webb would have appreciated that. He was always better at seeing the bigger picture than I was. I visit his grave on the first Sunday of every month. It's a quiet cemetery on the east side of Cincinnati. Old oak trees, well-kept grounds. The kind of place that feels like it exists slightly outside of regular time. I bring coffee, 2 cups, which I realize is irrational and do anyway. I don't always say much. Sometimes I just stand there, in the particular silence of that place, and feel the full weight of everything. The loss, the anger, the grief, the strange complicated gratitude for a chapter of my life that broke me open and rebuilt me into someone I recognize more clearly than the man I was before it. My father never knew what Gerald did. He never knew about the termination email, or the backdated documents, or the settlement, or any of it. He left this world thinking his son was a senior logistics coordinator at a company downtown who worked too hard and didn't sleep enough. In a way, I'm glad he didn't know, because the story of what happened to me is also the story of what people are capable of when they think grief will keep you compliant. And Raymond Webb raised me to be a lot of things. Compliant was never one of them. If you've made it this far, I want to say something directly to you. Not as a narrator wrapping up a story. Not as someone delivering a tidy lesson with a bow on it. Just as a person who has been in that specific kind of darkness, where you lose 2 things at once and can't tell which loss is heavier. Because maybe you've never been fired from a hospital hallway. Maybe your situation looks completely different on the surface, but I think you're here because something in this story touched something in your own life that you haven't fully put into words yet. Maybe it's a boss who takes credit for your work and smiles at you in the hallway the next morning like nothing happened. Maybe it's 7 years of loyalty being treated like it cost nothing. Maybe it's the specific exhaustion of being the most dependable person in a room full of people who depend on you, and realizing not one of them would return the favor. Or maybe you're just carrying grief and a job at the same time, and trying to figure out how a person is supposed to hold both of those things without dropping one. I don't have a clean answer for that last one. I'm not sure one exists. What I do know is this: Gerald Holt didn't fire me because I was failing. He fired me because he needed to protect himself from the promotion he had promised me. A promise that would have shifted power and credit in a direction that threatened him. He fired me at midnight in a hospital because he calculated that a grieving man wouldn't have the energy or the resources to push back. He was wrong on every count. And the thing that ultimately unraveled him wasn't a brilliant legal strategy or a dramatic confrontation. It was something far simpler and far more powerful: documentation, patience, and the decision to refuse the story someone else was trying to write about me. Workplace betrayal has a specific playbook. Learn to recognize it. When powerful people want to remove someone inconvenient, they rarely do it loudly. They do it quietly, through language, through paper, through the slow reframing of your competence and your character, until the termination looks inevitable rather than manufactured. They build a narrative before they build the exit. And they count on you being too busy, too tired, or too emotionally compromised to notice the construction happening around you. Notice it anyway. Save your emails. Document your conversations. Keep records of verbal promises. Send a follow-up email after every significant discussion so there's a paper trail that didn't depend on anyone's memory. Know your rights under employment law. And if something feels wrong, if the language suddenly shifts, if the reviews suddenly sour with no prior warning, if a promise quietly disappears, trust that feeling immediately. Not every situation ends the way mine did. I know that. The legal system is imperfect and slow and expensive, and not everyone has a Patricia Osei in their corner. I'm not standing here telling you that justice is guaranteed, but I am telling you that silence is always the least useful option. There's one more thing I want to say about Danielle Holt. I've thought about her a great deal since all of this ended, about what it must have cost her to open that investigation, to put her name on that report, to submit that written statement preemptively defending the integrity of her own findings against an accusation she knew her father was capable of making. She didn't owe me anything. She had never met me before that conference room. She had no obligation to choose professional integrity over family loyalty. Plenty of people in her position would have found a quiet way to file the folder and let it disappear. She didn't. I never thanked her directly. I'm not sure the situation ever created a natural space for that conversation. But if I could say one thing to her, it would simply be this: what you did in that room mattered. Not just for me, for every person who came after, for the standard you set about what compliance actually means when it stops being theoretical and starts being personal. Your father showed everyone who he was when he thought I was down. You showed everyone who you were when it would have been easier not to. That's the one that lasts. My father used to say that the worst thing a person can do is waste a hard lesson. I lost my job in a hospital hallway. I lost my father 6 days later. I spent months angry and grieving and rebuilding simultaneously, which is an exhausting combination that I wouldn't wish on anyone, and wouldn't trade for anything because of who it made me on the other side of it. The consulting work is good, better than good. I wake up in the mornings now, and the first feeling isn't dread, which sounds like a small thing until you've spent years waking up to dread and accepted it as normal. I have a framed photograph on my desk. Me and Raymond at a Reds game in 1998. 9 years old, squinting into the sun, holding a hot dog with both hands. Every morning I sit down at that desk and I see it. And every morning it reminds me exactly what I'm working to protect now. Not a position on an org chart, not a title on a business card, not someone else's quarterly numbers dressed up as their vision. My own time, my own name, my own story. Nobody backdates those. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more. And if you're sitting somewhere right now, in your own version of that hospital hallway, hold on. Document everything. And remember what my father told me at 2 a.m., with machines breathing around him and the whole world pressing down. People always show you who they really are when they think you're already down. Let them show you. Then show them who you are when you get back up.